Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 269 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, which is the final episode of the year, we're going to talk about accepting feedback and how we do it in a way that benefits us and the people around us, because not all feedback is good feedback, and we'll touch on that in this episode. So let's get into this one right now. Now, being able to accept feedback is a very important skill for leaders, but it's very difficult to do in my experience. Now, I see a lot of advice telling people they need to ask for feedback. The thing is, accepting feedback can be quite daunting, and when we ask for feedback, we are potentially opening ourselves up to attack. We're putting ourselves in a vulnerable situation. So we might hear something unpleasant that may take us by surprise. And of course, not all feedback is bad, but this is where many of our thoughts immediately go when we think of asking for and receiving feedback. So firstly, let's start with the basics. Why do we need to accept feedback? Well, it's one way in which we can receive information about how to improve and to know whether what we're doing is working. Now, without feedback, to some degree, we are flying blind. We can lead our teams and deliver our work, but if we never accept feedback, we'll never be sure about exactly how we're performing. Now, receiving feedback can be a helpful means of improving our self-awareness because it comes from an external source, that is, someone outside of ourselves. On the other hand, if we are only relying on what we think about ourselves, we may be overly critical, or sometimes we're exceedingly optimistic about how we're performing. So feedback in this way can reduce our blind spots, which are those areas where we may be unaware of our strengths or our limitations. So being able to accept feedback can also improve our confidence because we have information that may confirm that we're doing well, rather than just being uncertain about how we're actually doing. And there's a related article I'd encourage you to check out about blind spots and how to shrink yours to lead better. You can see that in the show notes page as well, which for today will be thoughtfulleader.com/269. Now, I see quite a lot of advice talking about how we should be asking for feedback to keep improving. Now, while I agree with this, I do think it's worth mentioning that we always have a choice about what to do with the feedback we receive. We can choose to accept it or reject it. Accepting feedback means that you take it on board as useful information. Then you use that information to adjust, to improve, to make a change in some way. Rejecting feedback doesn't mean you need to get angry or upset about it. It simply means that you make the decision not to take that particular feedback on board. I hear phrases a lot like, oh, feedback is a gift, which implies to me that we should always accept it. But some feedback is not useful and it's not a gift. Some people provide hurtful feedback to use it as a weapon, or sometimes people just don't have useful information to give you because they're not close enough to what you're doing to be able to give you any meaningful feedback. So we'll cover some of these factors now about whether you should reject or accept feedback that you're hearing. And remember, you always have a choice about whether you accept feedback or not. You don't have to take it on just because someone's giving it to you. And the first factor to think about is considering the context before you accept the feedback. So context is key when receiving feedback. Some aspects to consider include, the first one is credibility. Does the feedback come from a credible source? Do they have experience or knowledge that makes them a reasonable source of feedback? So if I'm trying to learn how to fly a plane, it's probably not great for me to receive feedback on how I'm flying from someone who doesn't know how to fly a plane. That may not be the best feedback. It's not always the case, but you've got to be cautious. So context is important. The second thing to think about is access. Does the person giving the feedback have consistent access to see how you operate? Or is it simply based on their perspective of maybe a once-off event? So maybe they saw something that's just happened once and they're providing feedback based on that, but they don't actually see your consistent performance over time. So therefore, their feedback may become a little less credible. And another thing to consider around the context is motive. What do you think the motivation behind the feedback might be? Is there a reason why somebody may try to throw you off balance with bad feedback, or does the person have your best interests at heart? And I'm not talking about people always being malicious and trying to give you negative feedback, but sometimes in political environments, feedback can be used as a bit of a weapon to throw people off target or to, unbalance them. So you've got to be careful of that as well in the context of that feedback. So it's always worth considering the context in your decision to accept or reject feedback. The second thing to consider when we're going to accept or reject feedback would be, is the feedback useful? So we should accept feedback when we can do something with it. So someone says to you something like, great job. Well, that's not useful because while it feels nice, there's nothing specific that we can take away from it. For example, I'd like to know, well, what exactly it was I did that was really good. And things like you didn't run that meeting very well is also not useful. What specifically should you have done differently in the meeting? So you might need to make some inquiries to dig deeper for information that you can actually act upon, because feedback is not that useful unless we can actually do something with it. Yes, it can make us feel good if we receive positive feedback, but what we'd really like to be able to do, in my view at least, is use that positive feedback to be able to do the good thing again and again and again, so we continue to provide positive service or performance or whatever we're getting feedback on. Another factor here to consider when you're going to accept or reject feedback is, does the feedback align with your particular direction? So even if the feedback comes from a credible source and has some specific useful information, it still doesn't necessarily mean that you need to accept it. There are millions of areas in which we can all improve in life. However, a much smaller subset of those areas are the ones that will help us get to where we want to go. So it's worth asking the question, will improving in this area help me to achieve my goals, or will failing to improve in this area hold me back? Now, without being discerning about the feedback we accept, we run the risk of focusing on every single improvement. Now, while improving in every area might be nice, it's probably not the best use of our time. It's probably not realistic either. Now, note that timing may also be a factor here. When I was at university, I was terrible at public speaking, and I once received very harsh feedback from a lecturer when I gave a presentation. Now, at the time, my response was, oh, who cares? I just won't do any public speaking. Now, as I progressed further in my career, I realized that this area was going to hold me back if I didn't get comfortable with it. And that's when I actually was ready to accept that feedback and make some positive improvements. The next factor to consider here is, does the feedback hurt? Now, feedback that is hurtful is not a sign by itself of whether you should accept it or reject it. So if something's bad feedback and it makes you feel bad, that doesn't necessarily mean it's useful. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should accept it. It's just a piece of information, right? So I do find that hurtful feedback can often be dismissed because we'd rather not have to deal with it. It also hits us where we're vulnerable, perhaps by exposing a blind spot or hitting us where we thought we were strong. And sometimes we feel like we can dismiss the feedback provider as being malicious because the feedback hurts us. So it's worth taking some time to consider whether you're leaning towards rejecting feedback just because it hurts your feelings. Hurtful feedback strikes a nerve, so it might be worth listening to, and there could be some golden nuggets inside if you can just get past that hurt factor and actually see the reality and the usefulness of the feedback that's there. Okay, so we've covered some of the factors to consider when you're going to accept or reject feedback. So next, I want to look at, okay, how do we accept feedback positively? The first thing you can do in this space is to pay attention. When someone provides you with feedback, it's worth really paying attention and trying to absorb what they're having to say. After all, giving feedback can be daunting and awkward, so the fact that someone has taken the time is worth noting. So try your best to listen and show all the signs of paying attention. So these are things that we do in active listening, nodding, making appropriate eye contact, encouraging them to continue speaking, and all those good things. You should also try to reflect back what you're hearing to confirm your understanding. This makes it look like you're paying attention, but also helps you to absorb what is being said. So, for example, if someone gave you a specific tip when you were running a meeting for next time, what could have been better? You could say, okay, so you're saying I should do this thing next time to make the meeting run a bit more smoothly. Is that right? So you're testing what they're saying, you're making sure you understand, you're playing it back to them, and then you know that you're getting the right feedback and you understand what's being said. The second thing to do when you're accepting feedback is to say thanks. So you can start with a simple thank you. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. Thanks for letting me know. Thank you for taking the time to tell me that. This doesn't necessarily mean you agree with the feedback or need to accept it, but it simply means you have heard it and appreciate the effort that the person went to give you that feedback. And if it's good feedback, you don't need to play it down or say, oh, it was nothing. You can simply say thank you. You also need to ask clarifying questions when you receive feedback. So you need to make sure you understand the feedback you're getting. Sometimes people will provide feedback without sufficient detail or context, such as why the feedback is important or why it's a problem. So asking questions forces them to take accountability for their feedback instead of dumping it on you without thinking. Now, when you believe you understand the feedback, why it matters, and what they would have liked to see instead, you can then make an informed decision about whether to accept or reject that feedback. So essentially what you're doing is you're helping other people give feedback better because you are making them clarify their thoughts by asking good questions. Another underrated step in receiving feedback is taking time to reflect. So when someone is delivering feedback, I don't believe that you should have just one chance to digest it and respond to it. Hearing feedback for the first time can sometimes be a bit of a shock. You might hear something you weren't expecting. Now, I think it's fine to be able to retreat, reflect, and then take action when you've had some time to process it. And this might mean you schedule a follow-up conversation with the person who gave you the feedback if there's anything you need to communicate or clarify, such as what you're planning to do about the feedback. So here are some simple questions to help you reflect on that feedback you're receiving. The first one is, how did the feedback make you feel? The second one is, what was it specifically about the feedback that made you feel that way? And then, based on the feedback, what are some practical actions that you could take to improve or to do better in the moment next time? And a good tool that I've created to help you reflect in a structured way is the Useful Thinking Journal. So make sure you check out the show notes page and get your copy of the Useful Thinking Journal as well. You can see the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/269. There's also a related article about why leaders should have a reflective practice that will be on the show notes page as well. I strongly encourage it if you don't have some sort of structured reflection in your life at the moment. It's a really good thing to be doing to keep improving and keep yourself feeling like you've got a sense of control about what's going on around you. And the last step I'll give you here for accepting or rejecting feedback is to actually make the decision to reject or accept it. So we want to make a conscious decision about whether to accept the feedback. So if you decide to accept it, think about what you might do to improve for next time. If it's positive feedback, this means thinking what you could do to keep this happening again, so to do something positive again. Now, if you decide to reject the feedback, this conscious choice hopefully helps you to put the feedback to rest. Now, what is not desirable is for you to continue to ruminate on the feedback again and again. Now, this rumination basically means you go over and over it in your head and you feel bad about it, but you're not really doing anything about it and it keeps spinning. You spin your wheels. So what you want to do is choose to accept or reject it and do your best to move on. And by the way, that structured reflection I talked about is a great way to try to prevent that rumination where you just continue to feel bad about a problem, but you haven't actually done anything about it. Now, another thing to note is that your takeaway from the feedback may not be exactly what the feedback said. Now, I deliver quite a lot of training, and last year I received some harsh feedback about one particular session from a small number of people in one group. And this took me by surprise because I felt the dynamic in the room was relatively positive throughout the session, but there were a few strong characters in the room. Now, after reflecting on the feedback for a time, I took a few practical things away. The first one was, I could have potentially shuffled the participants into different groups more often, which would have changed the dynamic of the room. I could have also used ground rules at the start of the training to make it easier to control the room. And certain topics could have been moved, sort of discussed offline to be discussed outside of the workshop environment because they weren't completely relevant to everyone in the training. So it's funny though, none of these points were raised in the feedback. In fact, some of the feedback indicated that certain people had quite a strong emotional reaction to certain other people in the room, and I received some of the blame for that. Now, while I'm happy to take some of the responsibility because I was running the session after all, I'm not willing to blame myself for how the participants were feeling. That's actually for them to process, especially as they raised this feedback after the session was over and not during it, not bringing it to my attention during the session. So from that particular feedback, I did take away some good practical ideas to implement, but these were not directly from the feedback. These takeaways came from my reflection and discussing it with other people afterwards. So you don't need to take on board exactly what was said in any feedback, but you may actually extract some powerful lessons from it in other ways. And when I gave you that story there about that feedback, you may have the impression that, I thought that, I received the feedback really well and it was fine. It actually really annoyed me at the time. And it took me a while to process it. And that's where the structured reflection came in and helped me work through it to land on those positive actions that I could take for next time. So that's what we're aiming for. So feedback can be a gift, but be intentional about how you accept it. So all feedback is not created equal. There is useful, constructive feedback, but there's also hurtful, useless, and vague feedback. So take time to be intentional about how you receive the feedback and with what you choose to do about it. And I'm interested in your thoughts here. How do you accept feedback? Are there any techniques you use or anything you concentrate on to make the process easier or better for you? Let me and all the Thoughtful Leaders know in the comments on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/269. And also, we have reached the end of the year. 2024 been another big year. And what I will say is early next year, that's when I open up for more coaching spaces. So if you are interested in potentially working with me to improve your leadership and confidence and set good boundaries and do all those things that thoughtful leaders sometimes need help with, then I'll definitely have some spots available. So what I'd encourage you to do is to fill out the coaching application form, which is on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/269, and see if we can set up a free consultation so we can talk about what your needs are and how I might be able to help. So do that. The new year is a good time to kick off coaching. So if you're interested in that, please do. Otherwise, have a great festive season and end of the year. I hope you get to take a break. And for those of you who are working over that Christmas period or the New Year period, we appreciate your efforts because it means other people can take time off. Thank you for listening once again. I really appreciate you sticking around and trying to learn more about leadership and be a better leader. And I will see you back in 2025.